So I have been thinking about this video for too long at this point. I've known this was coming as soon as I heard the announcement that they were doing a documentary podcast, which is basically just interviewing Miss Rowling. I knew that I had to do a reaction. Oh God, it's a two-parter. So chapter 1 is TERF Wars, chapter 2 is the tweets, and it's going to be talking...
For someone who's never heard the term TERF,
Oh God.
Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, what is a TERF? Where does that term come from?
You're asking
what
her.
Does it describe?
Oh my God.
I'm not sure you're getting quite how offensive a term it is to many people.
Journalist Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, and author of the book Difficult Women,
Oh
A
God.
History of Feminism in 11 Fights.
Oh God.
Think about it like the word queer,
Oh God.
which some people are very happy to self-describe as,
Oh,
and for
God.
other people it's the term that, someone with a...
Are we really going to compare the term queer with the term TERF? One is inclusionary and one is exclusionary by its literal definition. She literally says it in the oh my God. I am 2 seconds in. This is, oh God, help me.
and had shouted at them before trying to beat them up outside a nightclub. And that's how a lot of women feel about TERF. Some feel that they've reclaimed it, others feel...
Reclaimed it? Reclaimed TERF. I'm sorry. Oh my God, are you kidding me? Reclaimed TERF. As if somehow it is a good name that you can just reclaim. Are you Oh boy.
This is a word that they associate with people who want to slit their throat. So it's one that I would handle with tongs, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, and it kind of doesn't mean any of those things anymore. I'm often called a TERF, even though I've written in print that I think trans women are women. It doesn't matter, though.
I'm sorry. It doesn't mean that anymore? What the fuck does it mean then, Mary? Like, please, enlighten me. What does TERF mean if not trans exclusionary radical feminist? The fucking literal definite... Like, please, tell me, what does it mean? Oh, you're just some and first of all, just because you say trans women are women does not mean you're not actually a TERF. Like, let's be clear on this. Oh, okay. I'm already gonna be annoyed by this.
Just means this is a bad woman. You don't need to know any more about her.
Oh,
I mean,
God.
TERF is basically witch.
Yeah, okay, yes, please, play the fucking victim card. That's what TERFs are good at after all, so, like... I was like, that doesn't sound like J.K. I forgot she's... I don't really know what I'm hearing.
I had been becoming increasingly concerned about the way in which women were being shut down. Women who I felt had some very valid concerns.
Oh, concerns.
I was starting to see activists behaving in a very aggressive way outside feminist meetings.
Like, what were they doing?
They were banging and kicking on windows.
Horror.
Very threatening. They were masked.
Oh, masked.
I'm looking at an assault now on freedom of speech, freedom of thought, even freedom of association.
Girl, let me tell you something. If the people you're associating with make you look like an asshole, maybe you're not associating with the right people. Like, oh my God. I can't. I literally cannot. Oh, my contact is just trying to fly out of my face. I mean, I will say, like, random people coming and, like, yelling at you, like, let's not be dramatic about this. That is not, like, literally the shit that TERFs often are doing to trans women, which is doxing them, which is contacting their work, which is getting them kicked out of their housing, getting them kicked out of their like TERFs have very much spent a lifetime and decades perfecting destroying trans women's lives and telling us to kill ourselves. I did a whole video about things TERFs have said to me about how I should kill myself and how I'm so horrible and how I'm so fat and ugly and mannish and all this other shit. So, like, let's not pretend like someone telling you, hey, you're a fucking piece of shit for being this way is even remotely similar. Like, let's not pretend that those are similar conversations. Someone calling you out for being an asshole is not the same as the shit trans women face at the hands of TERFs. Like, let's be clear about this. Oh god, the angelic music. We gotta start playing Lacrimosa now? Come on. Jesus fucking Christ.
Chapter 4. TERF Wars.
Jesus.
Growing up, what did you understand feminism to be? Who were the feminists that you looked up to, and what did you see them fighting for?
I was very feminist in my late teens, early 20s, and I was reading books that even then were a little outdated. People like Kate Millett, Germaine Greer.
Can I just say this really fast? I just want to say, and it shouldn't have to be said, as a trans woman and a lesbian, I am not a feminist. Like, I feel like calling it trans exclusionary radical feminism as if radical feminist is somehow, like, they are more feminist than regular feminists just isn't reality. Like, there is nothing radical or feminist about being trans exclusionary. Like, I just feel like we have to start there as, like, the baseline, because having this conversation as if it's, like, a feminist issue to hate trans women and be against trans women and think that we should die and actively push us out of spaces that can help trans women, like, to me, that is not feminist. That is not you being a hashtag girl boss. Like, let's be clear. You are excluding people because of their assigned gender at birth and your assumption about their genitals, which that's a whole other issue. So, like, what are we doing here? Girl, this is going to be a lot.
Beauvoir, obviously, who was dead by the time I came to her book. I would describe myself now, and probably then too, as an idealist, definitely, but never really an ideologue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, TERFs are definitely known for not being ideologues.
Passionately concerned about the
there's that word again,
plight
concerned.
of girls and women, not only in the West but further afield.
Concerned. It's always the concern.
J.K. Rowling's born in 1965, and that means that she lives, her youth through a particularly vibrant time for the UK feminist movement. In 1971, the first women's refuge opened in Britain, in Chiswick in West London, and that was the first time that women who had been beaten up by their partners, had somewhere to go. They had somewhere to leave.
You're saying there weren't places like that until 1971?
Yeah, the first one was founded by a woman called Erin Pizzey.
Very shortly on.
Which, by the way, is a great thing, and those should exist always. But let's also talk about the fact that J.K. Rowling specifically spent her money to create a woman shelter that would exclude trans women who are, let's face it, very, very, very often likely to face aggression and abuse at the hands of their partners. And a lot of time, those are cis male partners. Like, let's not pretend that this is not issues that face trans women. Like, that's the thing that drives me so up the wall with these conversations, is like, they're using these things that nobody could possibly argue against. Nobody could possibly argue against the need for women's shelters, because they are necessary and they are a great thing that exists. But when you're keeping certain type of women out, that's a problem. And I'm going to be honest, I'm going to bet in the 60s and 70s, the other type of women they were keeping out of these shelters were going to be lesbians, if they knew or could tell. Because let's face it, that's pretty common too. But they're not going to talk about that, let's be honest.
We started. Women began to come and to talk about the fact they were battered at home by their husbands, and they seemed to be able to get no help from the social services, from the police, or from their solicitors.
And her stories about that first refuge are heartbreaking. You know, women walking in covered with bruises, covered in cigarette burns.
Oh my God.
Nobody seemed to be doing anything constructive to help. They just seemed to be sending these women back to the men who beat them, and some back to be killed.
In 1971, when Rowling would have just been a young girl heading off to primary school, the world was seeing the development of something that women in my generation grew up largely taking for granted. A place to go when you've been the victim of what we now call domestic violence.
He came home one day and he cut me right across here with a carving knife. I had to wait until he collapsed and fell asleep, before I could go to the hospital.
The things that people were going through in private behind closed doors during that time are now quite horrifying to reflect on.
He strangled me once, and all I could remember in the end was all this blood, thick, slimy blood, all coming out my mouth. I was on the line between life and death.
Oh my God.
And it was part of a wider movement that decade about the idea that you weren't just talking about what police used to euphemistically called wife beating, which was usually done in response, to nagging, and was therefore just a domestic. All of that language got swept away, and people instead began to talk about domestic violence, and that the idea that this was a crime and that was something that caused real harm and needed to be prosecuted.
Okay.
The shelter not only gave women a safe refuge, but it also raised awareness of how often these things were happening. And that paved the way for real changes in law enforcement and social services. This is the founder of that first shelter.
What? Okay. Again, I respect what we're going for here, but I don't know what this has to do with a conversation about TERFs, because you're trying to paint it as a feminist thing, and they're just concerned for women, and we know that's not reality, because they're only concerned for women who fit their narrative of what a woman should be or what they should look like or act like. Like, again, notoriously speaking, TERFs are very racist, fascist, anti-butch, anti-stud. So, like, all of these things that, often these are women, but you're not supporting those types of women. So I'm confused, but I'm also not, because let's face it, at the end of the day, this is a very clear narrative decision. As much as this, podcaster can try and say, I'm not trying to make J.K. Rowling out to be the victim. I'm not trying to exonerate her. It is very clear when you make the discussion, when you paint it in this direction and talk about feminism in this direction, when that is not the issue. When you're talking about TERFs, you're talking about a specific group of women who claim to be concerned about women and women's safety, which they don't give a shit about at all, because they put women, they take them out of safety all the time. Like, they put women in danger constantly. And not even just trans women, cis women, all the time. TERFs put cis women in danger all the time, or non-binary folks, they put them in danger. So this idea that we're going to paint this narrative very, feminist and make this whole big feminist crusade, and it's not. It's really not. So I do have to feel as though this is a very clear narrative choice to paint J.K. Rowling as this feminist crusader who's just trying to help. And, damn who she harms in the process, because she's just trying to help. She's a do-gooder at heart. Okay. Well.
Pitsy, speaking in 2014.
And the other problem also, unless she had a family to go to who would protect her, there was no money, because as soon as she tried to go to get some kind of security money from Social Security, they'd say to her, but your husband, in those days mostly, your husband wants you back, so therefore you're not entitled to anything.
Protecting women from both partner violence and the poverty that could befall them if they tried to leave their husbands became a primary focus of British feminism throughout Rowling's youth.
But those are still issues that women are facing. Like, those haven't changed. So again, to act as though, like, oh, she grew up in this world that is so, like, you know, feminist and this is so important. But again, that is not what we're talking about here. Yes, I changed my lipstick. Don't at me.
These protections and services in her own life.
Yes.
And while watching these women fight for their rights, Rowling says she also watched as they were constantly vilified for it.
British feminism faced all the
What does
same
this
attacks
have to
that
do with
American
trans
feminism did, that it was being carried out by ultra-leftists, by overgrown student protesters, by people who were, you know, probably lesbians or not normal women in
Let's not
some
bring up
other
lesbians
sense.
into this.
Feminists were hugely disparaged across the mainstream. They were ugly.
Yeah.
They didn't show
I
their
understand that.
armpits. They were aggressive. They were butch. And I suppose I see real parallels with now, with the slur that is TERF.
Again, comparing butch and TERF is a choice. Comparing lesbians and TERFs is a choice. It's all very telling, the narrative that she is making. And acting like this is this feminist thing, it's all very, very telling.
Under the banner of love, but now also under the protection of the U.S. Constitution.
Today, we can say, in no uncertain terms, that we've made our union a little more perfect.
Then, legal restrictions were dropped on same-sex couples' ability to adopt children. And a record number of LGBT candidates have been elected in races across the U.S.
80% of Fortune 500 companies protect their transgender employees. Most major cities protect their transgender residents.
That's not true.
Transgender individuals may openly join the U.S. military.
And in just the last decade, trans rights and acceptance in particular have come into the spotlight. Culturally, with the visibility of trans celebrities like Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner.
Oh, goody.
But also through a series of big institutional wins. From the dropping of restrictions on military service to the Bostock decision from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Supreme Court has ruled that LGBT Americans are protected by the anti-discrimination laws of this country.
Which they have since
Which
kind
in
of tried to roll
2020
back.
Ruled that trans citizens have equal protection under the law and cannot be discriminated against in areas like housing and the workplace.
This is a major civil rights opinion.
And yet, it
And
still happens.
Yet,
overnight protesters taking their battle cry for transgender rights directly to the White House.
There's also been a backlash to some of these gains. Whether it's from President Trump, who overturned Obama-era protections for trans healthcare and military service, or populist leaders across the world, figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are stoking attacks on the very legitimacy of LGBT identities altogether. But that was not the fight that J.K. Rowling would eventually step into.
Yeah.
I think the hardest thing for outsiders to understand is that there are two different arguments going on. One is the traditional conservative right argument, which is anti-LGBT. So someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary doesn't think people should be allowed to transition and, you know, wants to take away that right from them, which is part of a broader idea that kind of LGBT identities are decadent and postmodern.
Can we talk about the fact that it took almost 20 minutes to get to the fucking point?
And,
I know it's a podcast,
are
but
gonna
dear
sort of
God.
sap the vital life force out of the country. That is one criticism of modern LGBT politics. The other one is a criticism from the left, in which it says sometimes male people and female people have different interests, no matter how the male people identify, and we need to work out those conflicts.
So, let me just get this correct. You said the phrase, male people and female people have different interests, no matter how the male people identify. Do you see the issue with that sentence?
In policy and law.
Recently, a conflict has been growing within the political left among many of the very same people who have long fought for and cheered on these recent gains in LGBT rights. A conflict about whether sometimes the fight for trans rights is ever at odds with the hard-won gains of the women's rights movement.
That is very different from saying someone's a pervert or a degenerate, right? It says you are perfectly free to live your life. This is a perfectly valid identity to adopt. However, there might be times.
Oh, adopt! A perfectly valid identity to adopt. Yes, of course. Okay.
When it comes into conflict with other identities.
You know, someone pointed something out that I think is very, very important. And what they were saying was this. Like, being, trans women and cis women, yes, there are differences in our lives and existences and all of that. But it's no different from the differences between lesbian women and straight women, or women of color and white women. Like, there's differences in womanhood all the time. Really, that's where we're going with this? You don't see a problem with that. You don't see a problem with saying that, oh yeah, trans women are perfectly valid and fine, but just don't get in my way. Okay. Yeah, next they're going to say trans women are the reason that Roe versus Wade got taken down. Not conservative Christianity, it has to be us.
Take, for example, women's sports.
Transgender swimmer Lee Thomas is breaking barriers and records.
Thomas to the wall first, and that is a new Ivy League meet record.
Recently, a swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania, who competed on the men's team as a freshman, sophomore, and junior, transitioned and began competing on the women's team.
Leah Thomas dominated this weekend's women's swimming Ivy League championships.
Not only winning major championships, but also breaking women's swimming records.
Thomas is eligible to
everyone has, I swear to God, everyone saw that one episode of Futurama where Bender transitions so he can win gold medals, and they took that to be every trans person ever. Let me tell you something. Sports is never fair. The whole point of sports is that some people are just genetically better at sports than others. Guess who has never been genetically good at any fucking sport ever? This girl. Okay? It would not have mattered if I competed on the women's team, the men's team, any team. I still would have been shitty at it because I am not built for sports. This idea that somehow trans women have this big advantage because testosterone. Are you kidding me? No. Just like Michael Phelps has more of an advantage than any other Olympic swimmer because he can hold his breath longer. And he's long and lean and all these things that you have to be a swimmer. Like, let's not. I hate this conversation because it misses the point so hard. And again, it's discussing an issue that, like, I can't get on board with it. If trans people want to play sports, great, let them. I don't think sports should be necessarily separated by gender unless it's like contact football, but I know plenty of cis women who wanted to get into that. I had a friend, cis bi woman, who literally petitioned so she could play on the boys' football team, and did it, mind you. So, like, what's the tea? It's not that new. And she wasn't a boy. She wasn't trying to be a boy. She just wanted to play. And they let her. And it wasn't a big deal. No one gave a shit.
Under NCAA rules, which require transgender athletes to complete at least 1 year of testosterone suppression treatments.
This prompted many to come out and argue that it's unfair for someone who went through male puberty to join the women's team.
What
because
does
they
your...
argued the athletic advantages that come
No.
with male puberty?
No. Because again, say it with me now, someone who went through male puberty, this gal, didn't transition till she was 21, almost 22, so went through male puberty, if we want to use that term, and has not an ounce of upper body strength to my name. Like, it's gender essentialism. It's the idea that, oh, men are just naturally stronger. You're literally playing into the patriarchy when you say shit like that. And I don't, like, how is that not an issue? How is that not something you think is wrong? You're claiming to be feminist, but you're playing exactly into the patriarchy's hands by saying, oh, women are just so fragile and frail. And anybody who grew up a man and had male puberty, they're big and strong. Okay. I don't know what's in testosterone. I guess it's fucking strength in a can or something. I don't fucking know.
Cannot be fully erased in hormone therapy.
Oh, God.
You're never going to be able to remove male physical advantage. Not all of it. You know, you may be able to remove a third of it, or you may even...
And it also proves these people are not fucking biologists, because I can promise you, you lose muscle mass from hormones, you lose bone density from hormones. Guess what both of those things are when it comes to sports? Important. Muscle mass is very important to sports because it means you can do things. Like, you're strong, you can, you know, I don't know anything about sports, but the point is, I know enough to know that this is a bullshit argument.
This included Olympic athletes like Sharon Davies, Michael Phelps.
I believe that we all should feel comfortable with who we are in our own skin, but I think sports should all be played at an even playing field.
Him of all people talking about an even playing field. Sir, you, with all of the advantages you have because of how your body just naturally grew, you're gonna talk about an even playing field? Seriously? Okay, girl, sure. Sure, you want to play that game? Fine.
Caitlyn Jenner.
It is just not
She's an idiot too. Don't even get me started.
fair.
And also, feminists.
At the heart of all of this, there really are just two issues that people feel strongly about: fairness and
Oh, just two. Y'all didn't give a shit about fairness in sports any other time in the world, but because it's trans young people, suddenly we want to have a conversation about fairness in sports, as if sports have ever been fair. Some people are just naturally built to play sports, and it's so funny that we want to have these discussions. And, you know, someone else brought up this point too. You want to talk fairness in sports and changing your body to a, like, degree that you cannot ever recover from. What about the fact that gymnasts have to be trained basically from birth and really fuck up their body for many, many years? Or ballerinas who are trained from, like, what, 5-6 years old and fuck up their body to an impossible degree. But yeah, we want to talk about how some people, fairness in sports. We gotta be fair. Sports have to be fair because that's always been how sports worked. Fairness.
Many of these feminists point out that they have fought hard and are still fighting for funding and resources for women's sports. And they see a real conflict in interest here that needs to be addressed. But some trans athletes, like Thomas, ask, how is this situation all that different from the fact that there are real physical variations between all individuals?
Yes.
I'm not a medical expert, but there's a lot of variation among cis female athletes.
Because, I mean, the sad thing is, none of us are medical experts most of the time, but trans people kind of have to know this shit because it gets thrown in our face all the time by people who are also not medical experts, but boy, will they talk with severe confidence.
Quick note, the term cis refers to people who are not transgender.
There's cis women who are very tall and very muscular and have more testosterone than another cis woman.
Correct.
And should that then also disqualify them?
And by the way, a lot of these things about testing someone's testosterone levels and testing women's, DNA and all this shit does happen to affect a lot of a certain group of people. God, I wonder who is being affected by this most. And it's not trans women either. It is a group of cis women. Oh, right. It's women of color, because of course it is. And we're not going to talk about that fact, are we?
And many trans advocates say that attempts to prohibit trans women and girls from playing women's sports is a form of bigotry.
Yeah.
And this conflict becomes both more complicated and more contentious when it's not women's sports at issue, but women's spaces. Spaces like women's bathrooms, locker rooms, domestic violence shelters.
I have been in both women's bathrooms and women's locker rooms, and I guarantee you both of them were very uneventful and boring experiences because I was trying very, very hard to just get the fuck out. I wasn't really there to do anything but pee and put my shit in a locker because I was at a public gym. You know, what everyone else is there for.
And even prisons. In recent years, that tension has become much more urgent.
Yeah, but trans women are being put in male prison still.
Because of a proposed legal change that's often referred to as self-ID.
Well, campaigners are worried about potential changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which would allow men and women to choose their own gender, arguing it could enable predatory men to abuse women in single-sex spaces.
They're legal. Men who are gonna do that are gonna do it regardless. They don't need to change their ID because no one's checking an ID to go into a fucking bathroom, you moron. Nobody's checking ID. Nobody gives a shit like that. There's not fucking security guards outside of a bathroom. And by the way, my ID has said F for quite a while now. So even if they did check the ID, it's still gonna fucking say F. So, like, what are we talking about here? This argument that, like, oh, predatory men are going to go into women's spaces. They're gonna do it anyway because there's nobody patrolling to stop them. The only thing that stops anyone from using a man's bathroom or a woman's bathroom is literally just, like, the social contract that we've all agreed to. Like, that's not, ugh. And again, keeping out trans women just on the off theoretical chance that a cis man might use it to their advantage is really fucking stupid. Again, that is kind of the same argument as saying, well, lesbians shouldn't be welcome in these spaces and the off chance that they might hit on me. And there are people who do legitimately feel like that. And again, butch women are often the ones who are the most attacked in bathrooms, in women's bathrooms. I've been to a woman's bathroom many, many times, never had an issue, but I know so many butches who have had an issue in women's bathrooms. So, like, what are we doing here?
Question that it was going to be made much easier to change your legal gender was what made this not just an abstract discussion among feminists and queer theorists, but a matter of quite urgent public policy in Britain.
We say no to self-identification.
Oh, God forbid.
We say no to males in women's prisons.
Wow, really telling you said males in women's prisons.
UK. If a trans person wanted to be fully recognized by the government as their preferred gender, they needed to go through a medical evaluation.
Oh boy, we're using the term preferred gender now, so that's how far down we've gone.
And receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
Which has always been the case.
Which essentially is an intense discomfort that people can feel if their gender identity does not match their body. But this proposed change would allow people to alter their legal sex or gender based largely on, as the name suggests, their self-declared gender identity, without any medical requirements or diagnosis at all. It was a change some trans people wanted, in part because they felt that the need for a diagnosis was stigmatizing.
Yes!
The arguments came about the idea that, as it stands, the procedure involves gatekeeping. You know, you need to prove to doctors that you're trans, which is exactly what the trans activists hated about it, the idea that someone else gets the final stamp on your very personal identity. But the feminist argument was that some level of gatekeeping was necessary in order to safeguard single-sex spaces.
But,
in other words,
again, I think we're really oversimplifying this by saying, oh, well, feminists thought this was the case, so they're clearly the right ones because you're protecting someone against a theoretical danger when a very real danger against trans women is happening constantly, and this is not helping. So, like, I love when we talk theoretical bullshit. Like, okay, girl.
The removal of that need for a medical diagnosis, the elimination of that gatekeeping, concerned some feminists,
Well,
especially those shaped by movement.
Your concerns are definitely more valid than actual lived people's experiences. I can't imagine your concerns.
Like Take Back the Night. They worried that predatory males would find some way to take advantage
I hate
of these
the term
looser
male and
requirements
female.
to harm women and girls.
But the men who are gonna do that are gonna do that anyway. They don't need a fucking gender marker ID change, which, by the way, even with the diagnosis, even if you didn't have that, it's still a pain in the ass to do. Like, let's not pretend it's so easy. But, like, again, the men who are going to go into these spaces are going to do it regardless. Just because you paint this idea of this caricature of a man dressing up as a woman to go into women's spaces and harm them, as if that is not constantly used against trans women. Like, you can pretend like these aren't related at all. Like, it's just a coincidence. It has nothing to do with anything. Girl, the men who are going to do that are going to do it regardless.
They were concerned that in a good faith effort to make things easier for trans people, the government was aggravating risks to women.
I've been watching this.
See, the issue that I have is, again, you are talking about a theoretical risk that could happen at any point. Just because it's easier for people to identify as who they are legally, like, you don't need that to go into, like, if you're gonna go into a woman's restroom, again, your ID is not checked. Nobody's checking IDs to go into fucking bathrooms, and nor should they. But, like, even if they were, not gonna apply to someone like me. And what exactly is the issue here? You know what I mean? Like, you are saying, theoretically, if we made it easier for trans people and non-binary people to change their gender marker, a man could theoretically use that to his advantage to go through that process legally to change his gender just so he could go into a woman's bathroom, where your identity, your gender is not checked because there are not people taking ID. It's not a fucking club where they need to make sure you're 21. It's a bathroom. Nobody's checking your ID. So if a man wanted to do that, he's gonna do it regardless. He doesn't need to change his gender marker on his ID.
Been interested in it, and I did a lot of reading around it.
Oh, I'm sure you
and
did.
As this public debate grew, one of those concerned feminists was J.K. Rowling.
So I was already aware that the activism was arguing for this kind of self-identification. Therefore, an entirely male-bodied male can, by self-declaration, become, in inverted commas, a woman. Conceptually, as it were. He's now conceptually a woman. And I was troubled by that activism because...
But that's not what any trans person is saying. Like, she is taking a very, very specific idea and making it into something it's absolutely never been. And this is the kind of shit that TERFs do. So pretending like, oh, I'm just so concerned. And I mean, what if this happened? What if the sky fell? Like, what are we gonna do?
After a long life dealing with certain issues, whether as a donor or an activist myself, or from being a woman, I think I have a very realistic view, not a scaremongering view.
Okay.
On what may happen when you loosen boundaries around single-sex spaces.
May is the issue. And again, it is not loosening boundaries because you have never... maybe in the UK they do. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the UK has it way different than we do here in America. And I would imagine we'd be copying that if that was the case. But I have never heard of anyone in any country ever checking ID before permitting someone to use the restroom. So this idea that somehow women only spaces are going to be more in danger because trans people can self-identify is really absurd to me, because that has never been the case. You are not checking IDs. So what, and again, it's the possibility. She even is admitting in her own use of words that she has no fucking proof that this would happen. It's all in her fucking head. And I get it from like a trauma perspective. I get it from like a I've also been through shit perspective, and so you overthink and you feel some type of way. Like, I get that aspect of it. But let's not pretend that your shit in your own head should be the basis of any kind of legal anything. Like, let's be clear. Your trauma should not be legally affecting trans women. Like, what? And again, you know what's interesting too, and I know I've done this in my own conversations, but like, nobody ever is discussing trans men in men's spaces. Nobody's ever concerned about what could happen to someone who is biologically female in a man's space. No one's concerned that something could happen to him. They're only concerned about what a man could theoretically do to a woman in a woman's space. I think that's very telling.
Women and girls. So that troubled me. Have you thought through what this could mean for women and girls?
Could.
I already hear the screams of outrage. You are saying that trans people are all predators.
Yes, that is what she's saying.
Not anymore that I'm saying I'm a happily married straight woman. I know perfectly well all men aren't predators. I know that. I have good
and yet,
men in my life who are among my favourite people.
And yet.
But I am also aware that 98 to 99% of sexual offences are caused by those born with penises.
Is that I would love to see your, I'd love to see those statistics. I would love to see those source on that number. 98 to 99%. And she specifically said people with penises, which I think is very, very telling. And again, I'm not saying all trans people are predators. However, people with penises specifically, and I'm not going to say men because that would be too specific, 99% of them are. That feels, again, I'm going to need a source. I'm going to need you to cite your sources. I'm going to need to see the statistics. I want the paperwork. Like, you're going to have to do better than that. You're just pulling shit out of your ass at this point, which, shocker.
The problem is male violence. All a predator wants is access.
She of all people, I think, should be discussing the fact that in actuality, if we're going to talk bullshit numbers we pulled out of her ass, I would say the majority, 90% of all violence against women does happen at the hands of a lover, at the hands of a partner. Not just a stranger. It's people they know. This fear-mongering stranger danger of like men just lurking in women's bathrooms and just itching to harm them is like, you understand, if that's going to happen, it's going to happen regardless. Like, no legal precedent is going to stop that. Like, it's still against the law to assault someone, number one, regardless of who identifies as what. But number two, this doesn't take into account the whole fucking start of this podcast, which was about intimate partner violence, and now we're talking about stranger violence. Like, you spent 20 fucking minutes talking about intimate partner violence and how serious that is, but that is not the actual discussion we're having. Now you're talking about, oh, they just need access. That's all a predator cares about is access. Okay, but if they have access to you because they're married to you, that is access. If they have access to you because they're dating you, that is access. Because they're related to you, that is access. Let's not pretend as if anybody identifying how they identify legally has anything to do with access into bathrooms, because there's I feel like I'm arguing with a brick wall.
To open the doors of changing rooms or rape centres.
We're opening the doors now.
Violence centres. To open the doors to any male who says,
No.
I am a woman,
No.
and I have the right to be here.
No.
It will constitute a risk to women and girls.
Oh, God.
Now, that actually has very little to do with trans people and a lot to do with what we know are the risks from men to women. But this is the flashpoint. The activists who would argue against me, I've seen them say, but these are now women. And I say, well, here is where what a woman is becomes hugely important.
No, because I think you're splitting hairs here. And I think you're missing the point. Because it does have nothing to do with trans women. Again, I will say, your trauma with men has nothing to do with trans women. And again, just because someone, like, are they checking IDs when you enter a shelter? Are they? Because I guess that would be one thing. But, like, they're not checking them to get into a bathroom. They're not checking them to get into any kind of locker room. So already 2 out of your 3 doesn't fucking add up. So we're talking about things that are just not reality. You know what I mean? We're talking about a theoretical issue that is not reality. You're talking about men entering women's spaces as men, pretending to be women. And I'm telling you, that's just not happening. Because if they wanted to do that, we've existed for like 1,000 years. Trans women have always been there. It's not as if they couldn't have pretended this shit, 50 fucking years ago. You know what I mean?
And I also ask myself a question that I think is such a useful and basic question to ask yourself if you want to ascertain whether you're being intellectually honest. What proof would I need to see to change my opinion? And so I asked myself that question. Okay, so I thought, well, it's being claimed that nobody has ever abused dressing as the opposite sex, and no trans woman has ever presented a physical threat to a woman in an intimate space. Obviously, if I go looking and there's literally no evidence that's ever happened, well then clearly my fears are baseless.
Is that really what it takes?
And it's with no pleasure that I say that there was very clear evidence that had happened.
Our top story tonight, a transgender prisoner sexually attacked inmates in a female jail.
So there's a famous case in England of a trans woman called Karen White who was convicted of sexual offences and sent to women's prison and then sexually assaulted 2 women.
The court heard how she...
I guess the level of proof is like one person did it, so fuck, all of us have to pay for that. I could name 2 fucking transphobic trans women right off the top of my head. Does that mean we're all that way? No. Like, you're holding a small group of people accountable for the actions of one single person. I just don't get it. And again, that's kind of equivalent to, like, people holding all women accountable for the actions of, Eve. Like, seriously? We all have to pay for that bitch? It's the same thing. You're holding a whole group of people responsible for the actions of one person. The point is, you're holding a group of people and saying, you could possibly do this, so you don't get anything. Like, okay. Sure. I love that, though. It gives me no pleasure. I'm sure.
To put herself in contact with vulnerable women. She'd ended up in the female Newhall prison at Wakefield on remand after a number of sexual offences, including rape. Tonight, questions about how someone who'd raped women and who claimed to be transgender ended up in a female jail before undergoing any proper gender reassignment and was able to abuse fellow inmates.
I mean,
that happened.
I think there's an obsession that somehow, even if she'd had bottom surgery, that makes her less able to do something like that. Like, women do sexually assault people even with their vagina. So, like, I don't know, man. I just feel like this is missing the point. And of course, you have to pull out that one example because, you know, you can't prove you're not transphobic if you don't make trans people look bad just for the purpose of making a point. Like, again, it happened once, so that means anything is possible.
Big moment, I think, for UK feminism, for all these people who'd been told that this would never happen, to finally have evidence that in fact it had happened.
Oh yeah, of course it was a big moment for them because that proved all their fears right.
You articulate where those on the opposing side of this debate are coming from. Like, what is the steel man, good faith way to understand the argument that says
steel man as opposed to a straw man?
If your identity is female, then medical transition or not, you should be housed in a women's prison.
There is a completely reasonable argument.
I mean, I don't think we should have prison at all, but that's a whole other issue. And if you're gonna have that, I mean, at least keep people separate. I don't fucking know. I don't know.
Is that trans women are particularly at risk of sexual violence in
male
prisons. And that is a fact. There are lots of groups who are vulnerable, particularly in male prisons. Male prisons are in any case a really horrible place to be. The conditions are horrible. You know, they're violent, tense places to be. And, you know, America, with its much greater rates of incarceration, those problems are amplified. So I do think there is a completely reasonable point.
Well, at least somebody is being a little bit sensible with this, but I can't wait to see how she fucks it up.
Say, if you are a trans woman who has been convicted of a non-violent crime, is it going to be a huge risk to your safety to be put in a men's prison? Yes, it is. And the conclusion that Britain has come to really is that people with a gender recognition certificate, that is people who have legally fully transitioned, the presumption should be that they should be in the female estate. And then for everybody else, it's an individual case conference. But with the presumption that if you're convicted of a violent or sexual crime, you cannot be safely held in the women's prison estate. Now, that's not what's happened in America at all. And the ACLU, the great liberal organisation, have been fighting on behalf of trans women, some of whom have been convicted of violent offences, to stay in the women's estate. And that is...
Well, to be fair, a lot of those violent offences that we're talking about, let's have the conversation about, people who are, put in situations where they're being attacked and they're defending themselves, and suddenly now they are convicted of a violent crime because someone died because you were protecting yourself. So, that's... We're not going to get into that because that's a whole other fucking video.
The ACLU has also been fighting on behalf of trans people when it comes to bathroom access. And there's a similar argument playing out there. Feminists are concerned when they hear of assaults by trans women or males who pose as trans women in public bathrooms. There's one well-publicized example that involves an attack on a 10-year-old girl.
I don't know. Again, I think these conversations really miss the point. Okay, great. You have gleefully announced there are at least 2 scenarios in which this has happened. And that's disgusting and unfortunate. I don't know what this has to do with the argument. I don't feel like the ends justify the means here. Okay, great. There's 2 examples. And suddenly, we just gotta do it. We gotta make everyone's life harder. And again, we're not talking about all of the instances of cis women attacking, other cis women, or cis, people who have harassed trans women in bathrooms. We're never talking about that. We can only discuss the bad things trans people do whenever they do them, or people who claim to be trans, maybe, let's say. There's no way to know. We can only talk about those issues. There is never a discussion except a blip on the radar of oh yeah, well, trans women sometimes are more prone to have violence against them, but that's not really the crux of this story, so fuck them.
But it does happen. There are
when is this
documented cases of it. However, we should be really careful that we shouldn't play into a moral panic narrative that says that people
now
are
you want
to
to not
transition
play into that.
just to predate on people. The thing I would say is that predators exploit any loophole that they can, and that is something that we should always be alert to. When you're doing safeguarding, you can't have a kind of rosy view of humanity. You have to look at what the worst that could happen is. So I think while maintaining that it's rare,
that's
I think
really...
you have to acknowledge that it happens.
Because assaults in bathrooms are so rare, trans people often find it galling and humiliating when decision makers try to force them to use the bathroom of their sex at birth.
Yeah.
It's just...
Could you imagine, like, me, like this, me, in a men's bathroom? Yeah, that's gonna go great. Okay.
Routine, like, everyone goes to the restroom, everyone gets out. It's nothing, it's not a big deal.
Many trans people report that they avoid public bathrooms as it is.
Yeah.
Out of fear of being called out or even attacked. And this makes it difficult for them to just be in public, at a concert or a stadium, but even more importantly, at work or at school.
Mm-hmm.
And advocates ask, when the risk to others is low, why impose interventions that could make this tough situation any harder?
It's just going...
Well, I love the idea that we're talking about possible dangers, but not what happens to trans people. Not talking about, you know, any issue with, like, internally how it fucks your body up not to use the restroom. We're not talking about the danger we would face if we used the men's restroom. We can only talk about the possible danger that we could potentially maybe be to cis women. And again, all these conversations completely ignore trans men and, you know, any danger that they might face. Butch women can't even go into women's bathrooms most of the time without an issue. I cannot imagine how trans men would fare in a woman's bathroom.
The bathroom,
It's just, it's an obsession with, like, again, it's ultimately an obsession with trans people's genitals and an obsession with, you know, who's using what restroom and who's doing what in the restroom. I don't think about that shit. I don't care who's in the restroom with me. And I personally did not ever feel safe in a men's restroom, even before I transitioned. But I never really felt safe in any restroom because that's just not, I don't know, it's just not something I feel. So, like, I don't know what to tell you. I just feel like the bathroom shit of it all is just, it's so exhausting. It's so tired. It's such a, you know, that's like saying, well, you know, lesbians shouldn't be allowed in women's restrooms because of what could possibly maybe happen. Gay men shouldn't be allowed in men's restrooms because of what maybe could possibly potentially happen. You know, the only reason that people are talking about trans women in women's bathrooms is because of their obsession with the genital thing. You are so obsessed with, you know, penis and your assertion that trans women have it and that somehow that makes you more dangerous. Like, we need to get over this puritanical bullshit. We really, really do.
In an increasingly polarized world, gender issues have become the front line, and it can be hard to know where to start, how to express an opinion, if it's even okay to voice one. Yet as the chasm between opposing views increases...
If it's okay to voice an opinion. No one is stopping you from being transphobic. They're just calling you out on it. Let's not pretend like that's suddenly, oh, I can't say my opinion because people will call me out on it. Yeah. They're also going to call you out for being fatphobic and racist, you fucking idiot. People call you out when you talk shit. People call you out if you do agree with shit. People call you out if you prefer one fucking singer over another. There's just drama on the fucking internet. You voice your opinion if you feel strongly enough about it, or if you don't, why do you need to? Why does your opinion fucking matter? Which is ironic for me, I suppose, because I'm making a whole fucking reaction to this.
It's vulnerable children who've fallen into the abyss.
And finally, the issue that's brought this once obscure debate into the center of culture is the medical transition of young people.
Child transition. And that's particularly acute because the composition of the group of people trying to transition as children has changed, and it has grown enormously.
Now, in recent
They're not
years, there's
popping
been a huge increase in the number of children reporting gender dysphoria.
You know, we're talking about a difference in Britain between a couple of hundred people a year, 2,000 a year in the last decade or so.
The clinics here and in London see 3,000% more patients.
You know, someone has pointed out that the number of left-handed people, after it stopped being so like wrong and bad and something we tried to punish children for being left-handed, also went up in the years following it being okay to be left-handed. So were there just more left-handed people? Were there just, you know, children telling each other like, oh, be left-handed, come on, it's cool? No, that's not a thing. There are not children who are just transitioning because all their friends are doing it. I can promise you, just from my own experience in grade school that I remember quite well, being feminine is never a great thing in school when you're assigned male at birth. So I can really imagine that while some of them may be accepted and may have friends, and that's great, and maybe their school is actually not being shitty to them, and that's also great, I'm gonna bet there are still bullies who are treating them like shit for who they are. So let's not act as if, oh my God, you know, these kids, they're just transitioning because like all their friends are doing it. It's like the social contagion. Okay.
Than they did 10 years ago. Among girls, referrals are up more than 5,000%.
Across the Western world, there has been a sharp rise in the number of minors who are seeking to transition, especially among young females. And in just the US, the number of clinics that help young people transition has grown from 0 to more than 100.
But it's not like they're giving them fucking estrogen pills. You know what I mean? It's not like they're performing surgeries on young people. But you know what young people are having surgeries performed on them against their will? Intersex people, which is a group of people that are always left out of these fucking conversations as well. But, you know, that's not going to be discussed in this either.
In just the past 15 years.
There's no question this service is helping children who feel distressed in their own bodies. But the full impact of children making decisions about their gender at such young ages may not truly be clear until much later in their lives.
Oh, God.
5,000 children were referred to the clinic last year, and that's a 20-fold increase on the number a decade ago.
That's huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because now we know about
There's
trans
definitely
people.
something going on there, and whether or not those people are getting the right treatment is a big question when the treatments are themselves so new. Is a very fraught.
Really? Trans treatments are new? Hormones have been around for many, many decades, so let's start there. Even surgery has been around since at least the 1930s. But, like, okay, sure. Yeah, let's say that that's very, very new.
Question indeed.
One controversy related to child transition is a treatment often referred to as puberty blockers. Now, these drugs are not new. For decades, they've been used to treat a condition where a child begins puberty early.
Yes.
Sometimes as young as age 6 or 7.
Oh, Jesus.
Blockers halt that development, and then a child can resume the process years later, alongside their peers.
That's a very different use case than the modern way of using them for trans children, which is...
Why is that a different use case? Why? What makes it different? Because one child is trans? That's what makes it different? See, it's frustrating because I feel like you are separating people and assuming, well, if you're using them for a reason I agree with because I think it's appropriate, then fine. But if you're using them for something that I disagree with, that's a problem.
You block puberty in your natal sex and then go straight on to cross-sex hormones in the other sex.
No, they are not going straight on to... They are not giving children estrogen. They just aren't. I'm pretty sure, maybe, I don't know, the UK may be different, but in America, you have to be at least 18. So, like, let's start there. Nobody's giving... Oh, God.
Young people with gender dysphoria tend to be extremely distressed by their changing bodies. So general clinicians began using these drugs off-label to halt their puberty, and then later might introduce cross-sex hormones. So, for example, a female would grow facial hair or a male would develop breast tissue.
I've been concerned for some time that there are providers who are not following the standards of care, which historically have invoked the need for an individualized, comprehensive biopsychosocial evaluation.
Which I still think is bullshit as well, because being trans has nothing to do with mental illness. So let's start there. Just like being gay has nothing to do with mental illness. And up until the 70s, being gay was classified as a mental illness. So maybe we want to talk about that ever?
Prior to the initiation of medicines.
This is Dr. Erica Anderson, a psychologist who has worked extensively with transgender youth and who is herself a transgender woman. She's also a former board member of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. As Dr. Anderson told me, WPATH recommends that before prescribing interventions like puberty blockers, clinicians should methodically evaluate a young person, that they should take time with a minor and their parents to investigate any underlying conditions, and make sure that this is the right treatment for each individual.
But isn't that also kind of ableist to assume that if there is some other mental health condition that precludes you from being trans? Like, it just feels very ableist to me. And I guess we don't ever, can't talk about that.
But puberty blockers have become a flashpoint, in part because some clinicians do not appear to be following those guidelines.
So what I've seen in the USA, and this has been reported elsewhere...
And look, just because she's a trans woman does not mean she's not an asshole.
Going to providers and obtaining puberty blockers and hormones, but not having a full mental health evaluation. And I think that's sloppy. Bad practice.
I think you as a trans woman should know better than anyone that your mental health has nothing to do with your transness, but go off. Again, it's just ableist nonsense and transphobic nonsense. I mean, if young people really wanted to, I would presume they could get hormones on the street just like any other drug, but we're not going to talk about that.
It has become increasingly common for parents and doctors to adopt an approach where they affirm a child when they say they're trans.
Wow,
but
such
Dr.
a horrible
Anderson
thing.
says that some well-meaning clinics and doctors have gone further than that, and that in their attempts to support gender non-conforming kids, they have stopped asking important questions, and often too quickly accept a child's self-assessment.
Wow.
Some trans advocates argue that that's exactly what clinics should be doing.
Yes.
As this popular TikTok video explains.
No one says that cisgender kids are too young to know that they are cisgender. No, cisgender kids are pretty much always trusted to know their gender identity. If cisgender kids are young enough to know that they are not transgender, then transgender kids are young enough to know that they are transgender. It's as simple as that.
Yep. It's just like you're young enough to know your sexuality. But I don't think that saying a kid knowing that they're gay is somehow like, oh, you're too young. And people do say that. You're too young to know you're straight. You're too young to know you're trans. I'm going to disagree. But
it's not as simple as that.
Because bringing in children into this conversation, I don't know what this has to do with TERF specifically. But I guess maybe we're going to wait till the tweets episode for J.K. Rowling to discuss her fucking transphobia. I don't know. What am I supposed to say at this point? I think we're getting off track here.
Unpleasant as adolescence is, I mean, I hated adolescence. I do not romanticize adolescence. I think it's
yeah, sure. Your books about teenage wizards definitely don't romanticize adolescence.
Dreadful time. I remember times of pure joy when I was with my friends, and I remember fun. But if you ask me, do you want to go back to being 13 tomorrow and live it all again? I would say absolutely bloody not. I want to stay exactly where I am. But I do think that it is a necessary part of our development.
Rowling told me that watching this sharp rise in youth transition, especially the rise among young females, started to feel like a particularly feminist concern, and something that resonated with her from her own childhood.
I grew up in what I would say was quite a misogynistic household.
Yeah, same.
Like all young girls, I grew up with certain standards of beauty and ideals of femininity. And I felt I didn't fit into either of those groups. I didn't feel particularly feminine, and I certainly didn't feel, that I looked the way I was supposed to look. I looked very androgynous at 11 and 12. I had short hair, and I can certainly remember in adolescence feeling acutely anxious. I think this is so common. I think I know more women who have felt it than not. I felt very, very anxious about my changing body because you become aware it's attracting scrutiny that you don't welcome. I can remember the comments about your body, the difficulty of dealing with periods, period shaming, particularly from boys at school, this sort of squeamish fascination that young men have with female bodies that is a mixture of disgust and desire. It's very difficult to cope with that. I question my sexuality. I'm thinking, well, I can tell my friends are pretty. Does that mean I'm gay? Which I think is very common. I grew up to be a straight.
Well, now she's going for the you're too young to know you're gay fucking train, so that's great. What?
Woman, but I've never forgotten that feeling of anxiety around my body.
So is it your position that it's too big of a decision, essentially, for a child to make, to transition and experience these long-term consequences that they can't yet comprehend?
Personally, I don't believe even a 14-year-old can truly understand what the loss of their fertility is. At 14, if you'd said to me, do you want children? I'd have said, no, I don't want them.
Yeah, but I think we have to have the conversation that puberty blockers are not keeping anyone from potentially having children, at least not to my knowledge, but like, okay, sure. And again, I just feel like this is such a specific thing that we're talking about here that I don't know. And let me make this clear. I don't know what the correct answer is on this subject of like, whether or not I think you should allow young people to identify how they identify. I don't necessarily think, obviously, I don't think any person thinks that putting them on estrogen or testosterone at like teenage years is a good idea. 18, sure, fine. But I just don't feel like that's happening. And if it is, like, that's another conversation. But again, it's pulling at straws. It's selectively choosing what stories you want to talk about and what people you want to listen to and what other people you want to ignore. I don't know.
But it has been the most joyful, wonderful thing in my life. That doesn't mean I think everyone should have kids. It doesn't mean I think to be a woman you need to have kids. I'm talking very personally. For me, my children have been an unmatched joy, and I wouldn't change a thing. And I couldn't have comprehended that at 14. I would have had no idea what I was giving up.
And yet, as I sat with Rowling and listened to her views about youth transition, it was clear that they aren't black and white.
My feeling is, and it's a feeling that was strongly expressed in the Potter books, that as many diverse life experiences as possible should be explored and expressed. And having felt like an outsider in several different ways in my life, I have a real feeling for the underdog. And I have a real feeling for people who feel they don't fit. And I see that hugely, particularly among younger trans people. I can understand that feeling only too well.
But seeing this recent surge in numbers seemed like something worth questioning soberly.
Gender dysphoria exists. It causes massive distress. I know it's real, and I know there will be, I believe, a minority of people for whom this will be a solution. But in the numbers we're currently seeing, particularly of young people coming forward, I find cause for doubt and cause for concern.
I guess I have to wonder, though, we're still looking at like less than 5% of all children. Like, it's not, I feel like it's over exaggerating the numbers. And, again, this is not the main issue that I thought this was going to be about. So I'm just very like, what are we doing here?
So I did what I always tend to do when in that situation. So I read a ton
Run
of
your mouth.
books. That is my instinct. If I'm interested in...
Rowling said that she went out and bought some of the big best-selling memoirs by trans authors.
Out of this gender identity movement. So Jacob Tobias, Sissy, Andrea Long Chu, brilliant writer, females, Gender Games, The Trouble with Men.
She read essays,
Is Gender Fluid, Dr. Sally
and academic literature from influential thinkers like Judith Butler.
And I'm reading countless blogs and articles.
You're trying to have your views challenged.
Completely, because I really want to understand what is the thinking through personal experience, but also the philosophy, the ideology. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, am I missing something?
Yeah. I just feel like, it's great and all to read stories from trans people and to listen to us when we're speaking about our experiences in our lives. But it seems very apparent that that's not actually enough, because you're still actively saying and doing things that are contrary to what you're saying. You're sitting here saying, like, dysphoria is real, trans people are real, valid identity and all of this, but your actions are not matching up with these words. When you create spaces that keep trans people out, when you donate to causes that harm trans people and keep trans people out, when you say things about how, we talk about like biological sex, when we talk about biological gender and biological females, and you talk about those things, you are very explicitly excluding trans people. And I just feel like, it's all well and good for her to say, I support trans people, I am listening to trans people, all of this. I would love to believe that that's the case. I don't think it would change my feelings on her, because they are deeper than just her transphobia. I've talked at length about this, that there's a lot of issues with, J.K. Rowling and racism and anti-Semitism and, playing into these tropes and ideas that are, a huge, huge problem. And, I'm sure there are people who are going to argue, well, it was the 90s, it was different, blah, 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 blah. I don't agree. I don't think that makes it okay. However, my issue comes in when I consider the fact that, again, regardless of whatever else she's saying, her actions do not compute with that. And saying like, oh, people online have been mean to me and people have like protested me and they're wearing masks and, oh, that's scary. Again, it's painting trans people in a very particular light that makes you the victim and makes them the aggressor. And especially for trans women, calling us aggressive and masculine and mean and all of this other stuff, it has a profound effect. Even if I wanted to believe that J.K. Rowling herself was not a TERF, quote unquote, it is very clear that she has transphobic ideals and ideologies that are harmful to trans people, and she is actively working with people who are actively harming trans people. So whatever else she can claim to believe and think, it is very clear by her actions that that is not the case. And that is ultimately the issue that I have. I still haven't forgiven her for hiding behind her butch friend as if somehow that makes her transphobia okay, while also throwing butches under the bus as being inherently transphobic and, worried about the trans issue. That is its own issue, So like it is the equivalent of saying like, well, I can't be homophobic. I have a gay friend. That doesn't make you not homophobic, and that doesn't make you any less transphobic or a TERF because you can say the words trans women are women. Like that's not even a word she said. She said trans women are like a real identity. There are plenty of TERFs, as it turns out, who have, been sexually attracted to trans women and have even dated trans women and yet are still TERFs. So let's not forget, it's so much deeper than just saying, I believe that's a valid identity and a valid way for you to believe of yourself. That's very specific phrasing that I think she thinks gets her off the hook and makes her look better than she is. It's calculated is what it is. And looking back, it's very, very interesting because I do feel more often than not, her words and the way she chooses words is very calculated. And it's always been funny to me because, like, in the beginning of this whole conversation about, like, tweets and things she was saying on Twitter and, you know, trying to backpedal and act like that's not really what she believes. You know, this is a woman who has always been very, very calculated in the words she chooses. Her writing has proven that. She's very, very calculated in the way she describes things and the way in which she uses language. So to pretend as though this is somehow a coincidence that her words line up with what other TERFs and transphobes are saying, and that it's a coincidence that she's friends with people who are transphobes and known TERFs. It's a coincidence that she is doing all of these things that line up perfectly with TERF ideology and transphobic ideology, I think is missing the point. It's very, very, very clear to me that this is all strategic. This is all very methodical. You know, it's not an accident.
We're putting on an event tonight. We've got all these young people in bandanas trying to force their way in. They've got faces covered. They're actually being aggressive and violent.
She pushed me when she came in.
She fucking can! I pronounced the name!
In the past few years, as the feminists have tried to organize meetings and debates to discuss everything from women's sports to self-ID to the proper treatment of gender dysphoria in kids, they've been met with protesters trying to shut them down.
Yeah, but why do you get to be the ones to make that decision? Why do you, under the guise of feminism, get to make these decisions that you can, you know, meet and think that people shouldn't have a right to tell you that that's a problem? I just think it's very interesting that you want to talk about your freedom of speech being impeded, but someone else protesting you is them impeding your free speech rather than them expressing their own free speech. You know what I mean?
Trans women are women.
Yeah.
Full stop. And to them, to engage in a debate at all is to engage in transphobic hate speech.
I think it is funny to suggest that engaging in a debate with TERFs is somehow like a thing you can actually do. Like, when someone tells you to your face religiously that you should kill yourself because of who you are, when someone tells you that you are not who you say you are, that you're a man, that you're bad, that you're this, that you're that, and you want to say, I should debate them, I should have a conversation with them, I should have a dialogue with them, when you inherently do not see me as a person, do not see me as a human who has feelings and emotions and, you know, that can be upset by that, and you think I should debate that type of person? No, we're not doing that.
And then we come to the famous two-word slogan, the stock phrase, no debate, no debate, no debate. We hear it all the time. That alarms me.
Because
really alarms me.
There's nothing to debate. You're debating whether or not trans people have a right to exist. You're debating whether or not trans women are women. That's not a debate. And you can't have a debate with someone who insists on saying you are not a real person, you are not a human being, and you should not be allowed to live. Like, that is not a debate. That is someone telling you you do not deserve to live, you should die or kill yourself or anything else. Like, that is not a debate. That's not a discussion. That is someone slinging hate on you and you telling them, well, why don't you debate them? Why don't you have a discussion with them? There's nothing to discuss because they're not having a discussion. Someone throwing hate at you is not a discussion. You're not debating some asshole on the internet who calls you fat or ugly or stupid or anything else for any opinion you have. Nobody's debating that. So, like, this idea that, oh, trans people are just so unwilling to have conversations, like, You know that's not true, number one. But number two, you are entirely missing the point. And I just think that's... Look, yes, okay, I can admit J.K. Rowling is not the sort of TERF, as far as we know, that is telling trans women to kill themselves or calling them men to their faces or doxing them. As far as we know, that is not something she is doing. That does not mean that her actions are not harmful.
I can't think of a purer instance of authoritarianism.
Oh, Jesus. Now she's trying to say we're authoritarian. Oh, boy. Is this over yet? 15 minutes.
That is the attitude of the fundamentalist. You may not challenge my ideas. That makes you evil.
Yeah,
I am righteous. I don't have to explain my righteousness. And I am...
Why should you have to...
Therefore...
Why should you have to explain yourself to someone who does not see you as a person? That is what I'd like to know. Why are you asking me to explain myself and my feelings? And why should I have to explain anything? Like, why does anyone have to explain anything? Saying trans women are women, full stop, is not something that should be a debate. So, like, I think it's very funny how she's selectively choosing what should and shouldn't be debated here.
To bully you, to harass you, to silence you, to...
But you're not being silenced. Just because people are calling you out does not mean you're being silenced. Ma'am, you just got a huge book deal for a 1,000-page book that's all about being canceled, which you have never been. You continue to get movie deals and book deals and make trillions of dollars off of your merchandise for a book series you wrote 30 years ago. So spare me the woe is me, I'm being canceled for being real.
Take away your livelihood.
No one's taking away your livelihood.
I've had things thrown at me. I've been accused of things I have never done or said. People seem to have no concern about evidence or even about libel.
I think it's so funny to say people have no concern about evidence. Yeah, TERFs are very unconcerned with evidence about anything, but okay, sure. Yep, you're the victim here. Okay.
Many of the feminists labeled as TERFs have been attacked and received death threats, along with accusations that, despite what they say, they are actually Nazis and fascists.
Well, yes, that is, look, there is no denying TERFs very much align with Nazi and fascist ideology. I will say, I personally do not agree with death threats on anyone. That is just not something that I believe in. That's its own thing. But I don't think it can be overstated, again, that trans women are on the receiving end of death threats very, very often. So this idea that, TERFs are the only victims in this and that they're the only ones who are receiving death threats and the only ones who are the victims of violence or people saying shit about them online, like, that happens to trans women all the time. And even to this day, frequently, because it happens to me frequently. I was just, 2-3 weeks ago, sent a message that was, "You're a man, kill yourself." So, like, it's not as if it's something that doesn't happen. And I'm not saying it's okay for other people to turn around and do that. But what I'm saying is, this is not an issue that is exclusive to just TERFs and poor them because they're getting all this hate and that's so hard for them. Everyone deals with that. Like, let's not pretend it is unique to you as a TERF.
There have been physical assaults. A woman called Maria McLaughlin, she was at Speaker's Corner in London, which is an infamous site for freedom of speech. It's where people can go say whatever they like, pretty much. And she went there to a feminist meeting and she was physically assaulted. By a trans woman called Tara Wolf, who was convicted of assault, who had said online before going to that meeting, "I want to fuck up some TERFs."
When I cover this subject, I often say that afterwards I need to relax by covering something uncontroversial like Israel-Palestine or abortion, right?
Wow.
It's extremely fraught.
This is Michelle Goldberg, reporter and columnist at the New York Times.
Again, I say, look, I don't agree with those actions, but when you have been the person who has experienced a lot of people telling you to kill yourself and telling you you're a man and telling you, you know, you should die and you're bad and you're this and you're that, it, you know, I can understand wanting to, you know, bitch slap a TERF. I've said it myself. I've never done it, but I've certainly thought it. So, you know, whatever. Again, I don't agree with it. I'm just saying.
And one reason it's extremely fraught is that you have two groups of people who legitimately feel extremely embattled.
You wrote about this conflict in The New Yorker in 2014 in an article called What is a Woman? And even back then, you talked about how intense the threats and intimidation tactics were towards feminists who were voicing these views.
I love that. I love that we're only talking about the intimidation against TERFs and not the intimidation and threats that trans people face. Because as much as this person is trying to, Megan Phelps Roper is trying to act as though she is impartial, it is very, very clear she is taking a stance that often is painting trans women as the aggressor always, and not talking about, almost never, in fact, in this hour-long thing, I think she's talked about violence trans people face once or twice. She's never talking about the violence that TERFs perpetrate. She's never talked about the doxing that TERFs have done for years and continue to do. She's never talked about calling people's work, you know, calling them this, calling them that, you know, the active harm that TERFs do all the time. She's only talking about the harm that possibly, maybe, could be, has happened once or twice, or never, maybe, we don't know, from trans people. That's all we want to talk about. So it's hard not to feel like there is a very clear and distinct viewpoint that the creator of this podcast has. And it's not at all surprising that, as much as she maybe pretends to the contrary, that she's not trying to vindicate J.K. Rowling, it's very clear she is.
You quote some of the online threats in the article, which said things like, "Kill TERFs 2014. How about slowly and horrendously murder TERFs in saw-like torture machines and contraptions?" A young blogger holding a knife posted a selfie with the caption, "Fetch me a TERF." Such threats, you write, have become so common that radical feminist websites have taken to cataloging them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, those quotes that you just read.
Yeah, but even if you don't make a threat, radical rad femmes will catalog anything a trans person says and decide to use that against them. And let's be clear, making a statement of, like, you know, kill TERFs or whatever, again, it's such a minority group of people, whereas TERFs, by and large, are actively harming and saying trans people should kill themselves or that they should die and all of this stuff. But we're not talking about that. Like, it's never come, at no point has that come up in this conversation. And of course it's not coming up. But it's very telling that it's not coming up.
I don't think those people are representative of the trans rights movement. But nevertheless, there's a lot of feminists who feel like aggrieved at people kind of constantly saying, if you don't recognize me as a woman, I'm going to rape you. They feel like there is this
that something
very vicious online dialogue in which a really brute sort of misogyny is dressed up in progressive clothes. And so, you know, to add insult to injury, you're not even supposed to complain about it within feminist spaces.
It should be possible to have a discussion where there are a range of different people who can enter into a dialogue about this.
Okay, but a dialogue requires both parties to be willing to have a conversation. And I think it's very difficult when one party is telling you, you are not a human being who deserves to live. And let's face it, even if there are like 10 trans people who were saying that about TERFs, TERFs are by and large, and have been saying this about trans women for decades. This has been going on since at least the 1970s that we have documentation of. So just because TERFs are finally getting a taste of their own medicine, everyone wants to rush to their defense and act like, wow, these trans people are just so fucking mean, man. And they're just being so like harsh and vindictive and so bad. And it's like, no, you're experiencing what you have put trans people for the past 40 fucking years.
These feminists believe that their views are not only inside the bounds of respectable discourse,
well, of course
but
they
also
do.
that the accusations that they are violent transphobes feels less like a sincere criticism and more like an attempt to smear them.
But it's literally what's an attempt to smear you. It's literally what's happening. Again, why are we not talking about this?
So that no one will listen.
And another thing too, if J.K. Rowling wants to have an open dialogue and an open debate and conversation, I realize I'm a small YouTuber, but I'm right fucking here. You want to have an open dialogue and debate? I would love the opportunity to speak to you and say, hey, can we have a conversation and talk about these things that other people are not talking about with you? Because I feel personally that if you want to have a conversation and say there should be an open debate, there should be an open dialogue, you cannot have these conversations without trans people present. And it's very telling that these conversations are being had about trans people without any trans people being present in this.
I mean, what we're seeing in the world is more and more people shutting down free speech. You're
Jesus.
censoring ideas. You're shutting down controversy.
I love it. I love it. Calling out TERFs is shutting down free speech. Wow. Man, it's 1984 up in here. You're being called out for being an asshole. God, your free speech must just be so dead. I don't even know. I feel so sorry for you getting called out for being an asshole. It's so difficult.
Feels less like a sincere criticism in academia, in journalism, and the arts. Women athletes have been dropped by advertisers. Authors dropped from book deals. For voicing her concerns, Dr. Erica Anderson, a trans woman who's helped dozens of kids medically transition, has been labeled a TERF and disinvited from public events. Michelle, from your reporting on this over the years, what is the best way to understand the side of the protesters in this conflict? The people who are calling to silence these debates, where are they coming from?
Again, you're debating whether or not trans people have a right to exist. And that's the issue. And again, you're doing this without having trans people present. Or if you do have trans people present, it's trans people who already agree with your rhetoric anyway. It's not a debate. You are saying one thing, other people are saying another thing. And when you disagree, at any chance you get to, point trans people as being violent or misogynistic or bad or wrong or aggressive or anything else, you will do. And that's just what it is.
And what do they feel is at stake in all of this?
Well, look, what's at stake for a lot of people is just the ability to live their lives with any sort of dignity and security. And again, I want to emphasize, and I hope this makes it into the podcast, that is why I think the temperature of this is so high. Because, especially in the United States, trans people are so embattled. You have these sweeping oppressive laws, 119 anti-transgender bills.
But I do want to say this, because I guess we're almost done, and I don't think this is going to be discussed. It's not just on the right that we have these issues. It's not just Republicans that are, being transphobic. So this idea that, we're just baselessly attacking these feminists for being feminists is just not reality. And that's, I think, the ultimate issue is like, to act as though, oh, well, it's mostly just Republican stuff. We're just getting caught in the crosshairs because they're mad about something else. It's just,
Have been introduced in state legislatures this year alone.
Suing the state of Alabama after the governor making their way through Ohio's legislature.
Arkansas passing a bill blocking gender-affirming care for trans.
Activists are calling the move an attack on the LGBTQ community.
Despite the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that protects transgender Americans from discrimination, and despite President Biden overturning the Trump-era policies against trans health care and military service, there have been hundreds of proposed or recently passed laws that have sought to limit trans people's access to bathrooms, their participation in girls' and women's sports, and to restrict medical transition for minors.
Or adults.
And some of the laws come with severe penalties.
Last week, Alabama became the third state in the nation to pass a measure restricting gender-affirming care for transgender and non-binary youth, but it's the first state to actually impose criminal penalties. The law would make providing that care a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison.
That seems very dramatic.
Online, just as there are some trans advocates who send violent and harassing threats toward the people they call TERFs, there are also many others, often coming from the right and the alt-right, who send violent and harassing threats towards trans activists and their allies.
Are we really gonna say that it's only the alt-right and conservatives who are sending a harassing message? Oh my God. You're really out here trying to make TERFs look like a legitimate good thing. Wow. Okay.
Some based on accusations that any attempt to teach kids about trans identities is actually a smokescreen for a desire to sexually exploit young children. And in this climate, many activists feel that feminists calling for open dialogue and good faith debate,
which is not what they're doing,
just opening them up to greater harm.
But it's very nice to say, and it's very idealistic to say that any TERF is open to good faith argument or debate. But who gets to determine what is and isn't good faith? Because if you agree with what the TERFs are saying, then sure, that's good faith. But if you're disagreeing and saying, hey, this is not right, and this is why it's not right, which many, many trans people have done. I myself have made countless videos talking about why this shit is a problem. And yet you still get thrown under the bus. You still get harassed. You still get, told to kill yourself. So for me, I do have to wonder how much, it's very, very telling how, Megan Phelps Roper wants to paint TERFs as like the ultimate victim in all of this and paint this idea of like, well, it's only the alt-right that's really doing most of the harm. It's not TERFs. They're not doing anything. They're just trying to have a good faith, open dialogue, which is not reality and has not been reality for many, many, many years. This isn't even this is something that's been documented so often. I mean, for God's sakes, Leslie Feinberg was documenting this shit and documenting transphobia. It is not new. Trans people, non-binary people, lesbians, everyone has been talking about this shit for literal years. And it's just really astounding that we have reached a point where there are people who claim to be not taking sides, who are actively trying to paint TERFs as just trying to have a good faith debate. And that's just not reality. It's just not reality.
I think that what is so painful for them is that, they feel like these issues of daily survival are being treated as secondary to culture war flashpoints, around these kind of relatively few handful of cases involving women's sports, these few cases where there's really hard calls about things like prisons or domestic violence shelters. And people that I've spoken to feel that the intense focus on these issues is itself kind of undermining them, right? That like they feel so under siege. And when people are really scared and they're really under siege, then they don't want to have a kind of searching, probing conversation about the legitimacy of their identity.
But again, why is the legitimacy of my identity something that should be up for debate? We're not, most people are not debating the legitimacy of lesbian identity, gay identity, you know, unfortunately, bisexual identity is still up for debate for a lot of people. It shouldn't be, but let's face it, that is a reality. But like for the most part, LGBT or, LG, as it were, is not something that most people are debating the legitimacy of. So why is it trans people, it's okay to debate the legitimacy of our identity? Why is that something that is necessary? And why is that, if you don't want to do that, you're not having an open dialogue? I don't need to debate who I am. I know who I am. I don't have to prove myself to anyone. I am not interested in proving myself to anyone. So this idea that, trans people just aren't willing to have this good faith debate about their identity. Why should you have to? I don't understand that. I don't understand why any person should have to have a debate about their identity.
Kind of obvious reasons. Yeah, and they don't want to hear debates about, nuanced issues when they feel like they're fighting for basic rights.
Right. I mean, I think you'll often hear people say, I'm not going to debate my basic humanity. And part of the difficulty is that there are indeed certain issues which we have sort of decided somewhat collectively with some sort of consensus are beyond the realm of debate. And I think that part of what is so difficult about this issue is that there's certain people who think that this kind of consensus can be imposed maybe as opposed to evolve organically. And so they're sort of desperately trying to shore it up in the hopes, I think, that if they can, they will enjoy the same sort of assumed protection as other groups whose rights we've decided are not up for public conversation. I think the problem is that we don't actually have a consensus about what gender means or what makes someone a boy or girl or woman or man. And so you still have to talk these things out and have these conversations.
No, you don't. Because it's nobody's business. It is nobody's business. If there are people who want to have these debates and conversations, fine. But I don't think it's inherently that we should have to have them, as if it is anyone's public right to decide who you are. That's my point. I don't have an interest in having a debate about it because it's not, it shouldn't be up for debate. I don't see a reason to debate it. And again, that is not, saying, is it up for debate? Is it something, people just want to have a good faith debate about it, is not the reality. TERFs are not sitting here having good faith debates. They are saying, you are a man because you have these genitals. You are a man because I say so. And being a man makes you less than human. Kill yourself. That is not a debate. That is someone saying unequivocally, you are less than human because I personally don't like you. I cannot stand men. I have made that very, very clear. I do not like men. Full stop. And yet, I am not telling them, you are less than human, kill yourself. I'm not going to say that because I don't need to say that. I will just avoid them as much as humanly possible. So, the fact that TERFs go out of their way to find trans people who are just minding their own business, the fact that TERFs go out of their way to, find trans people and attack them because of how we see ourselves and identify and know who we are, that to me is the issue here. That is not having a good faith debate when you are having a conversation about someone in a feminist space without trans people there. That's not having a debate. You're having a conversation without these people present. Or seeking these people out specifically to attack them. That is also not having a good faith debate. So all of these situations and conversations that are allegedly happening, you're talking about things like, you're just not willing to have a good faith debate about your own gender, but that's not actually what you're asking for. You're asking me to defend my gender for your approval. But why? Why is that necessary? Why do I have to defend my... Listen, you don't have to see me as a woman. That is fine. I don't give a shit. I know who I am. But you don't have a right to tell me who I am. Just like I don't have a right to tell you who you are. So if you want to sit there and say, you don't see me as a woman, whatever, fine. But I don't feel that you have the right to tell me that. And you could say, oh, well, that's my free speech. Then it's my free speech to call you an asshole and tell you to get the fuck away from me. And if you think that's aggressive and scary, then that's on you, bud. Let's get this shit show over with.
People who believe that, but the people who are policing the discourse have maybe outsized visibility.
Okay, so let's go back to 2016, 2017. You obviously are a very public person. You are not shy in general about speaking your mind. And it seems like you've had really strong views about what you were reading, and you had done a ton of reading and research and thinking. Did you want to join the public conversation at the time?
Did I want to join the public conversation? Yes. Why did I want to join it? Because I was watching women being shut down. And it was as though there was no woman perfect enough to say her piece. If she's a regular woman with no particular platform, she's a bigot. That's that. You're a bigot. If she's an informed woman who is working in a sphere where this will really have an impact, and for example, I saw a prison governor speaking out, this is not okay. These are already traumatized women. Huge abuse hurled at her. Shut up. You don't really understand. What do you know about being a trans woman? It seemed there was always a way to shut down women's voices. People are terrified of speaking up.
I have five more minutes of this, but I think I've said everything that I can say on this subject, which is that, you know, at the end of the day, I think making this an issue of, oh, women are being silenced by trans people, and because we're saying we don't want to argue who we are, and that you telling us we are not who we say we are, and more importantly, saying that we are bad and wrong because we exist, that is the ultimate issue here. You can, try and paint it as 50 other debates. You can try and throw in all this other conversations and, talk about violence against women as if that is something that is unique to cis women and does not happen to trans women. You can have all these conversations, but again, you are having them without trans people present. You are having them about trans people. And it's not actually a debate that's being had. It is you making unequivocal statements and making trans people look a very specific way and pointing out very specific cases of things to further justify your hatred. And ultimately, this video is not going to change her mind. It's certainly not going to change any other TERF's mind. I don't even think this video is going to change anyone who might be on the fence about transphobia. I don't believe that personally. But I will say, my point in saying all this and reacting to this is I feel as though these conversations are, first of all, they're tired. They're tiring. People weren't worried about trans people in bathrooms, 30, 40 years ago when we weren't as visible. But it's very telling that these conversations are being had now just because we are more visible than we've ever been. We weren't having these conversations. We weren't talking about these things. And yet now, suddenly, these concerns and fears that did not exist, or at least weren't as publicly stated this way, are taking the forefront. And it's hard not to see that as a very purposeful thing and a very telling thing. But again, I will say, and my final thoughts are going to be this, I would love if at the end of this, J.K. Rowling would be willing to have an actual conversation publicly with a trans person to say, let's talk it out. If you want to have an open dialogue and talk about these things and talk about dangers and risks and all of this other stuff, then let's have an open dialogue with an actual trans person. But I just don't feel like that's going to happen. Or if it does happen, it's going to happen with someone like Caitlyn, who's already, known and already problematic in her own fucking right. I think Laverne Cox or Janet Mock would be a good choice. I don't think it should have to be either of them. But, I just, at the end of the day, I just can't help but feel like this conversation is very centered around making one group of people look very, very innocent in their own, actions, and make them look like, oh, they're just being reasonable, and all these trans people are being very unreasonable and uncooperative and unwilling to debate their own identity and their own life. And I find that problematic, and I find that exhausting, and I find that very tiring. And so my whole thing is, I will not be listening to more of this. I will not be reacting to more of this, more than likely, because I feel that it is very, very evident the side that Megan Phelps-Roper has taken in this conversation. Feels very evident the way in which she has decided to portray trans people, and specifically trans women, in this conversation. And I don't think I need to hear more, because I think there's nothing new to gain from any of this, besides potentially, AdSense dollars and watch time. But as far as, I'm not going into this expecting to learn something new about J.K. Rowling or her beliefs. I'm not going into this expecting to, have my views changed or challenged, because I don't think that that's the point of this. I'm not going to change anyone's mind with my video, and I don't think that she's going to change anyone. Well, maybe she will. Maybe there will be people who don't understand the TERF rhetoric, who don't understand what's not being said, who will take this at face value and say, oh, well, maybe she's not as bad as people are saying. And I think that is ultimately kind of the purpose of this. Like I said, it's all very, very telling. It's all very, very not surprising. It is all very, very old. A tale as old as time, as they say. This is nothing new under the sun for trans people. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else I can really say at this point. I think I've said my piece. I have said everything I can possibly say. I've talked at length for probably 2 hours now that I've been listening to this, at least. I am quite tired. I am quite exhausted, quite frankly. And I don't have anything more to say. So, yeah, if you like this video, comment down below, subscribe to my channel. I don't know if I have anything more to say on this. If I do, maybe I'll put it in the edits, but yeah, this was something. I don't know what. I don't really know what I expected. I did not expect the interviewer to make any kind of effort to actually hold J.K. Rowling accountable. I'm certainly not surprised that she hasn't. But yeah, so that is it. That's all I have to say. I'm not surprised by any of this, but I am exhausted. So until next time, stay devilish.